If you've ever used Cinema's Espresso node system, you'll know that nodes can be a very powerful way for you to control your objects, especially when it comes to animation. Well, with the node material system, you now get all that additional extra power, but in a node system. So if you've ever wished, perhaps, for example, that you could take a noise shader and apply it to the color, the displacement, the luminance, and a few different areas all at the same time, well, with the node system you can. You're no longer forced to copy and paste shaders from one channel to another. Come with us and we'll go show you how the node system can work. One of the biggest features in R20 is absolutely the node system. Down here in your material area, you'll be used to double clicking to add a standard regular material. But if you go up to your create menu, you'll find there are a few other choices. So here's your standard material you've always been adding over the years, but we now have the node material and its associated friends, the Uber material, and these special ones down here. Now, I will explain the node material in a second, and of course let's add one into our scene. But to explain this node system, let's just get ourselves a bit of space here. To explain this node system, it's a good idea to sort of give you a quick little history lesson about the material system, because the way it works and what was added does very much inform what happens here in our node system. So roll back a few years, roll back a few versions. The reflection channel, as it used to be called, used to be very, very basic. So we're talking sort of back in version 14 here, I believe. The reflection channel used to look a lot like all of the other standard channels. You would choose a color, you would choose a brightness, and then there were a couple of extra settings underneath which allowed you to choose how blurry or frosted the reflection was. But back in around version 15 or so, they overhauled the reflection system. They made it far more powerful, they gave it a lot more features, but in a lot of people's eyes they also made a fairly big mistake. This is a lot more complicated than it really needs to be. So when they overhauled the reflectance, they gave us the ability to layer up multiple layers. So you could have a fancy car paint by having a color and then adding a metallic flake layer into your reflection, and then on top of that you could add another layer to make it sort of all nice and glossy and shiny over the top. So it was far more powerful, you could do more things with it, but it was a bit tricky because there's a lot of settings here you probably don't care about, sampling, masking, and it just made all these settings really, really huge, especially if you've got sort of more than one layer. This list started to get really, really, really long when you're trying to edit your material. But the other thing, the thing which probably most people missed, it's very rare that I come across anyone who sort of realised this other behaviour I'm about to mention. It is entirely possible for you to not have a colour channel on your material. What you could do is go to your reflectance and add a soft diffuse layer into your reflectance system. If you stop and really think about it, everything you see is actually just a reflection. Now, in common language, when we're speaking to each other, you would say a reflection is where it sort of goes all nice and shiny and glossy. The glass on my desk has a reflection. The paint on my headphones has a reflection. But in reality, even very matte, diffuse surfaces are actually just reflections. If you have a piece of white paper, it looks white because the light is shining off it, it's reflecting, but it's just in a very, very soft diffuse way. So even if I add a reflection to my old basic material here, sure, this is a nice shiny glossy metallic reflection, but if you made it rough enough, if you made it more matte rather than gloss, if you keep pushing, eventually you will end up with a white, matte, diffuse material. So just bear that in mind as we go forward. There is, strictly speaking, no difference between a matte, white, soft reflection and a shiny, glossy, metallic one. Obviously they look different and will have different settings, but they are both reflections. That's the key thing. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and here's a bit of terminology for you. All these layers which we were previously adding into our reflection system, The technical name for these is BSDFs. Bidirectional Scattering Distribution Function. And don't worry, I'm never expecting anyone to remember this because frankly it doesn't matter. But just keep in mind, whenever you see the word or whenever you see the letters BSDF, it is essentially referring to a layer of reflection. You can just think of them as simple reflections. Okay, right, now the history lesson is over. Let me show you how and why the node system works and why having a bit of background information about this is sort of quite useful. So here we go, let's jump into our node. Much bigger window this time. So if you've got more than one screen, this is the kind of thing you would probably dedicate an entire screen to, because it does take up quite a bit of space. Anyway, in here, let's have a look at what we've got. This node on the right, this is your material. This is where everything is going to end up. This node on the left is one of our BSDF layers. So you can think of this node here as one of these layers in the reflectance system. Now, they'll have various inputs and they should be fairly familiar. You know how on the old material system we had color, luminance, bump maps, displacement, etc. Well, we do still have more or less the same thing on our node system. This input layer here, this diffuse BSDF, and I'm going to stop using those letters now because they just get very boring to say. I will simply refer to these from now on as layers. These layers are the color channel, effectively. Emission, so another thing they've done along the way is they've renamed a few things. There are some industry standard terms which maybe perhaps cinema wasn't using as much as it probably should have. So you know it as luminance, but it has now been renamed to emission. It's emitting light. That's probably the best way of explaining it. But you've still got alpha channels, normal channels, displacement channels, so a lot of the familiar ones will still be on this list. Now, there will be a few missing, but that's just an inherent way of how the node system works. So for example, let's take bump. Well, a bump map, a bump channel, is mathematically, programming-wise, it's actually the same thing as a normal channel. So the bump is gone and we now only have the normal channel. But don't worry, all your bump maps, all your nice grayscale images, we will still be able to use those. You have been thought about. Anyway, let's say goodbye to our legacy material and let's jump over to our nodes. So what we have here initially then is this one layer leading into our material. To change the settings, you click on the layer itself and have a look over at this sort of attributes manager that the nodes has. Well, okay, here's the obvious bit. Choose a color. You can either click on the color chip and this will unfold things for you to choose your color. So let's go for maybe some green. There we go. Or of course, if you look really carefully, there is a teeny tiny little black arrow. This will unfold and allow you to change your colors in real time. So you're probably going to want to keep this unfolded most of the time, I would have thought. Okay. Now, what about images though? In your old material channel, you're used to choosing either a color or loading in a texture. Well, you'll notice, there's nowhere here for me to load in a texture. Well, again, this is just a fundamental way of how nodes will be different from standard materials. Color can be defined by simply selecting a color, or it can be defined by leading in a texture image. So we have inputs. This is where we can feed things into our layer, and one of them is just color. So we've got a few ways of sort of doing this next bit. Let me just wipe that back out. Sneaking ahead there a bit. So on the left-hand side, we have a series of nodes. There's well over 100 of them, in fact. And these will allow you to do all sorts of things. Really basic things like just merging layers, or all the way to the standard shader things. So all your shaders with sort of noise and checkerboards and those sorts of things, these will also be in this list. Now, being a great big whacking list, it's obviously going to be hard to find anything. But if you come up to this bit at the top where it says Assets, you may notice there is a little magnifying glass. So long as you click on here somewhere, you will now get a search bar. So if I want to feed an image into this node system, first I will need an image node. And there's a few ways of doing this. Let me show you a few of these. So option 1 is I can just literally type in image, and it will give me every node which has anything to do with images. So yes, we've got an image processing node. That's not the one we're after, but this would allow you to change brightness, contrast, gamma, etc. And then we just have the plain old image node itself. So we're going to drag one of these into our node system. There we go. Okay, so this is where we can choose our image. And the first setting, lo and behold, it's asking us for a file. So if we click on the buttons over to the side, here's some of my personal textures, but obviously just use whatever you've got laying around on your hard drive. Let's say I load in a picture of some sponge. In we go. We can just skip past this window. You've probably all seen this window 1,000 times before. Hit yes or no, doesn't make much difference. Okay, so here we have a spongy image node. I don't want pink, I want sponge. We need to connect these two things together. And there is a bit of color coding for you. Yellow nodes are for just basic color information. Grey nodes are for sort of values. So typically you'd control these with some sort of grayscale value, or you can just feed numbers in. And the purple ones, these are for vectors. Don't worry about those just yet. We'll get onto those in a moment. But let's do the obvious thing. Let's drag our yellow node into our layer, and lo and behold, when I release the mouse, we have a sponge. Yay! Cool. So that's one option. But another choice you do have, so let's just delete this, which you may find faster, is if you already have some files on your hard drive open in a window, and you'd just like to use perhaps this radioactive hazard sign, you can just drag and drop. Let's make it a bit smaller. If I just drop this hazard sign into my node canvas, it will give me an image node with the image already loaded in, and again, of course, just connect it up. There we go. Option number 3, though, is more or less the same thing, but a bit quicker. Cinema is very context sensitive, context aware. If I drag a danger sign onto the color input port, it will not only add the image node, but it will also connect it for us. That is probably one of the fastest ways you will have of loading an image in. The final method I'm going to show you for now, there is one or two others, but I'll save those for a little bit later. One of the final options you've got is, once again, let's say I would like this emergency sign here. If you already have one, you can drag and drop this on top of an existing node and it will replace it. So there are your image loading options. More useful, more powerful, more capability. But let's go ahead and do something. Let's go ahead and do something else with this. So I'm actually just going to go back to my sponge image because I think it'll work quite well for this next thing I want to show you. Let's make this a sponge. So let's take the next sort of natural step. How do I do a bump map? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, we don't have a bump input anymore. It's just not there. And this is because, really, strictly speaking, there was never any real difference between the bump channel and the normal channel. Both of these allow you to give the impression that the surface has raised up and down. But in reality, it hasn't. So whilst a bump map would use grayscale values to make the surface raise up and down, all it was actually doing was tilting the surface around to give the impression that it tilted. So we don't really, strictly speaking, need two separate channels because they're one and the same thing. Let me just grab a web browser here for you. So, a typical bump map. Let's just be lazy and find some sort of image. So a typical bump map would be something like this. Just a grayscale image where the grayscale values would cause the image to go up and down. Something like this. Whereas a typical normal map would look more like this. instead of using black and white to go up and down, it uses red, green and blue to tilt the surface upwards with cyan, downwards with purple, left with pink, and sort of right with this bright blue cyan colour. So by using red, green and blue, you can kind of make the same thing as a bump map. Now, as you'll see here, we don't have bump maps. So what we need to do is convert things. If I go to my list of assets and I search for bump, you'll find the only thing which comes up for now is a bump map node. And this is specifically for converting things. Let's drop this in. And we should see we have a yellow input node. So this is expecting some color information. And we have a purple output node. This is going to be spitting out a vector, or if that's not familiar terminology for you, it's going to be spitting out a direction that the surface should face. So I can feed my sponge into the conversion node, which now gives me this nice pinky purple vector node, and I can feed that into the normal channel of this layer. And what I will now have is my sponge image creating a bump map for the surface. If you want to see a bit more detail on these, by the way, you can right click and as ever choose different shapes or choose different sizes. So I can just go a little bit larger. Or this would probably be a good time for me to mention how you navigate. Navigation in your node view is the same as it is everywhere else in Cinema. If you're the kind of person who uses 1, 2 and 3 on your keyboard, you can continue to use these. If you hold down number 1 and then click and drag your mouse, it will start to pan around. Hold down number 2 and click and drag, and you can zoom in and out. And basically all the other keys should work as well. If I press H, it will frame all of my nodes. So anywhere you're used to navigating, you can do it here. For those who don't like using 1, 2 and 3, but have a middle mouse button, you can use that as well. If you hold down your middle mouse button, this will pan around your node system. And of course, if you've got a middle click, you almost certainly have a scroll wheel or a scroll sensor on your mouse. Just scroll the middle mouse scroll wheel, or for the Mac users with your weird magic mouse, start stroking it seductively in the middle of the mouse. And you can now, of course, zoom in and out this way. And actually, I should mention there are a few other new input methods with R20. Mac users with a multi-touch trackpad, you know how you might normally use 2 fingers to pan around and pinch to zoom in and out. Give that a try now. You'll probably find your trackpad supports both of these for navigating around the nodes. Windows users, you're not quite left out. It will depend a lot on which laptop you have. Not all Windows laptop trackpads are multi-touch. So give it a go, maybe it works. But I will say, if you happen to have a touch screen machine, you can do all those gestures by touching your screen. Just drag 2 fingers, or well, 1 or 2 fingers, it depends exactly what model laptop you've got. Drag 1 or 2 fingers on the screen and you can start panning, or do your pinch to zoom just like you would on your mobile phone, and you can start zooming in and out as well. So enjoy your screen full of greasy fingerprints. Anyway, I think that'll do for navigation. So yeah, back onto our nodes here. So what we've got here is a single layer with some bumpiness driving into our material. And just for the eagle-eyed who have noticed it, when I dragged and connected this normal node into the normal channel, you may have noticed, hold on, there's another one over here. Which one are we supposed to use? What's the difference? Well, your materials will be made up of multiple layers. So to use a typical example, let's say you've got a wooden surface. You would have one of these BSDF layers for the wood, another one for how shiny and reflective the wood itself is, and then a third one perhaps for a clear lacquered gloss over the top. If you bought the Grayscale Gorilla top coat, this is the kind of thing you probably bought it for. But each of these layers can have its own bumpiness. The wood surface, or in this case my sponge, the wood surface is bumpier than the clear lacquer. So you can put different bump maps or we can put different normal maps into each of these. Or if you're just thinking, you know what, I don't care about specifying how bumpy each layer is, I just want one level of bumpiness for everything, well, that's what this one over here is for. If you double click on this line, it will get rid of it. And you could then pipe the bumpiness into the entire material. And now everything will have this bumpiness, not just this one particular layer. Anyway, let's put that back because I will now show you some extra layers. Okay, so let's pan over here, maybe zoom out a little bit. So we've got these images driving our base layer here. But what if I want to make this sponge have a bit of shiny reflection? Well, we need another layer, because the shiny reflection sort of is almost like a separate powder coated layer, or maybe this is us sort of putting a gloss paint over the top. So on your material, all this stuff over here, this is one layer system. On the material, you have an add button. Don't press it. All that happens when you hit the add button is you get a new layer, but it's completely blank and there's nothing connected. So save yourself a bit of time. Oops, I think I've undone a little bit too far there. Where have we gone? Oh, here we go. So save yourself a bit of time. Don't click the add button to add a new blank input port. Use the small little drop down next to it. On here, there's not much in here, to be honest. In fact, right now there's literally only 3 things. I expect there's probably going to be more things cropping up in the future. But for now, it's a bit of an empty menu. But as I say, these are BSDF layers. So click the pull down menu, come down to surface, and just add a new BSDF layer. When you do this, you get the new input, but you will also have a new node already connected into it. Yay! So we now have our second coat of paint on our surface. But by default, it's a plain white matte finish. So think of all of this like a layer system in Photoshop, Illustrator, or After Effects. If I have this white paper material sitting on top of my lovely bumpy sponge, it's just going to completely cover it up. This stuff down here right now may as well not exist. So I need to do something else with this layer. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it into more of a glossy reflection. When we add a new BSDF, it's going to appear as this plain, diffuse, soft matte surface. But actually, I'd rather this thing show up as a bit of a gloss. So with this layer selected, hop on over to your settings to the side, and you'll see the very first setting is what kind of reflection is this? What sort of BSDF is it? Well, we don't want it to be a soft, diffuse surface. We want it to be something shiny and glossy. And a very quick little crash course on these reflection types. This is not the definitive Bible on everything that these things do, but just as a very quick rundown, if you would like something metallic, go for a GGX reflection. If you would like anything else which is generically reflective, so carpet, wood, plastic, stone, anything else in the world, go for Beckman. This rule is not strict. You can use one or the other. They will both do very similar things. But just as a quick rundown, GGX for metals, Beckman for everything else. So I'm going to put a generic reflection onto my surface. Okay, so we now have this sort of a shiny, glossy metal thing. So how do we get our sponge showing through? We just wanted a bit of shininess on the sponge. Well, we need to tone it down. We can do this either through just the simple sliders of our material, or we can do it through a Fresnel system, and I'll show you both. So if you just want to tone down this metallic reflection, on your material, you'll see we have this Beckman, that's this guy, and this diffuse, that's this one down here. Do feel free to rename these things, by the way. If all this Beckman and diffuse is not helping you, just double click the name, and I could call this one my base sponge, and I could call this one over here my my general reflection. And you'll see when you go to material, they should now have those names. So if I turn my general reflection down, let's say sort of 10-20%, you'll see we now get the sponge with a bit of reflection coming through. So just balance this wherever you need it to be. That's one choice. This is a very basic way of doing it. If you're looking to make things more realistic though, you should look at doing Fresnel. So Fresnel, again, just for the uninitiated, if you have, go grab a hardback book off your shelf. What you'll probably find, so a hardback book without a sleeve around the outside, so one where it's just printed directly onto the sort of cardboard. What you'll usually find is when you look directly at a hard, flat surface, there's a very small amount of reflection. But if you look at the object with a glancing view, things will become more shiny and more reflective. So the angle you look at the surface actually changes how glossy and how reflective that object will actually look. And if you're after a realistic material in cinema, we need to do the same thing here. So for realism, leave this thing set back at full, which will turn it into this sort of chrome, and instead go for the Fresnel. So on this particular layer, just select it, and you'll see one of the settings you have is Fresnel, or if you feel like pronouncing it this way, Fresnel. In here, you've really got two choices: conductors and dielectrics. I'm not sure we really need to search through these ones. Thank you, Maxton. Conductors are essentially metals because they conduct heat and electricity. That's the easiest way to remember it. And then dielectric, that's just everything else. Everything else which isn't metallic is considered a dielectric. So I'll go for this generic dielectric Fresnel. So now the front of my object will be not very reflective, but as we get around to the outside edge, especially if I zoom in over here, it will become more and more glossy. And you've got the same old settings you're probably used to from your reflectance materials of the legacy material. We can go ahead and choose how rough the surface is. So if we don't want this level of glossiness, we could just blur it out a bit, make it rougher and rougher and rougher until it's just a bit of a soft shine. So by the way, these two material previews, this one is showing you strictly what the reflection is adding, and then this one here is showing you what the final material is going to look like. So if you can't quite see what it's doing on the material, this preview to the side is quite useful because I can now clearly see very, very easily how blurred and how rough I've made my surface. So if I just put this somewhat soft reflection on, that's kind of nice. But what if I've also gone and put a nice glossy lacquer over the top of this whole thing? Well, that's just yet another layer. Let's zoom out a little bit. Oops, let's not fold those down. Let's zoom out a little bit. On my material, let's go to our pull-down menu and add yet another BSDF. Here we go. Here's number 3. You can sit over here. And let's give it a name now. You can be my glossy top coat. And we'll do pretty much the same thing. We'll change it to be a nice shiny reflection, and hey, let's just go mad. Let's make it a very slightly metallic reflection. And once again, do the Fresnel thing. Fade it out using a dielectric method, and we'll now have some soft reflection there and some glossy reflection in the corner. So using your nodes, you can start to build up literal layers of substances onto your materials. Okay, so here with a nice new fresh node material, let's investigate some of our assets a bit more. So over on this left hand side, you will broadly find there are 2 categories of items in this list. If we just give it a little bit more space, you'll find there are core basic built-in nodes. Now, these will be super basic items. So for example, if I search for some noise, you'll see we've got a few choices. We've got some which say built-in, and we've got others which say utilities. Now, the idea with this node system is that you can put together your own shaders, your own abilities, your own tools by just connecting a series of simple blocks. You know, you could almost make a sort of a Lego analogy here if you like. So we have, for example, this basic built-in noise option. And okay, here's some noise. We've all seen a noise shader before. But if you look at the settings, there's not that many settings. Usually we're used to the ability to choose how large the noise is, how squashed it is, brightness, contrast, all those sorts of things. Well, the idea with the node system is that you can put together your own shaders by just using quite basic building blocks. And Maxon have included quite a number of pre-connected node systems for you to make use of. So with this basic noise, we've just got maybe half a dozen settings. You can choose a type of noise, but that's really about it. If, however, we come down here to the one which just simply says noise, here is a larger node with some more settings, and if you look over at the attributes, wow, we've got a lot more stuff in here. This is far more what we're used to traditionally with noise, and in fact, compared to Cinema's standard noise shader, we have even more settings in here. So we can now choose, let's see, where have we gone? We can now choose the size, the number of repetitions. We can spin and rotate this thing around with our rotation slider. We get to choose where the pivot point of that rotation is, so you can offset it. So we have tons and tons of settings. But each of these things, each of these settings, these are in actual fact other nodes. You see, what we have here is this is a sort of a collection of nodes bundled up into a single item and then presented to you as just a nice, simple, easy to use node. The proper name for this, by the way, is we call this an asset. Now, I know everything here is referred to as assets, so maybe a bit of a naming clash there. But what we can do is we can convert this sort of a fully complete asset into a collection of its raw individual nodes. So let's take a look at these first four similar icons at the top over here. These allow you to group things up and ungroup them. We'll do that maybe in a moment. But we also have the option to create an asset or convert an asset back into a group. So just to show you the basics. If you have a couple of nodes connected and you think, hey, these two things are great, you can treat them as one thing. You can select these two items and then convert this into a group, and they get bundled together. But this exists only for this material, only in this project. I can't access this bundle of nodes in any other material or in any other project. So what you can do is you can take it one step further. You can convert this into one of Cinema's assets, which would be this next icon here, create asset. Now, I'm not going to do that just yet. That's a bit more advanced than we really want to go on the basic one. But this noise here is an asset, essentially a bundled, saved, named, sort of curated collection of nodes. So what we can do with this is we can go the other way. We can take this asset and we can sort of convert it into a group of nodes. So when I do this, not much really happens, but this item here is no longer this. This is now its own thing. I guess the best analogy would be a bit like taking an object in your 3D scene and making it editable. This convert asset to group command is effectively the node's version of making something editable. It isn't something you're going to need to do too often, because hopefully these assets are good as they are. You don't need to do too much. But once we have made it editable effectively, we'll get this extra little icon here, this little arrow. And this allows us to enter the node, or rather enter the group. So let's just get a little bit more space here, because this is where it starts to get a bit hairy and you wish you had a larger screen. But this is the bundled noise asset. So in order for them to give us these positioning and placement abilities, they've used various UV transformation nodes and reprojection nodes and fed them into the noise in order to allow us to change the brightness and the contrast and those sorts of things. We have color correction nodes and multiplying and subtraction nodes which will adjust the colors. So all of this bundle here is this noise asset to the side. And just so you're aware, you can go ahead and make these yourself. If you have this great idea for a scratches asset which would automatically add scratches onto a surface, or maybe you're a towel manufacturer. You make nice fluffy towels. Perhaps you've got a collection of nodes with noises and displacements and all sorts of other jazz in there, and you think this is it. This is like the perfect towel shader. You could select all of those things, group them up, and then, if you wish, convert that group into an asset. That asset can then be kept and used in other projects. You can distribute it to your customers or your clients, or hey, you could even go off and sell this asset if you think it's that good. Anyway, let's leave this here. Let's not delve too much into the asset side of things. This is supposed to be an introduction video. So how do we get back? How do we get back to where we were? Well, we've got these breadcrumbs at the top. So this is the node system, and we are currently looking inside group number 1, which is this noise asset. If we click back on the word node, this will take us back to where we were, and we're now outside of our noise asset here. So there are lots of other collections of nodes bundled together presented as items for you. For example, if I were to search for something to let me change colours, so effectively like the old filter shader you're used to. If I search for colour, and we'll do this American way just to make sure we get all the items, we have, for example, basic built-in nodes like colour correction. Now the colour correction node here will allow us to just do really quite simple things. Hue, saturation, and value, which is essentially brightness, but that's really about it. There's a little colorize checkbox, but it doesn't really go much further than that. If you want something with more power, again, look out for this little thing where it says it's part of the utilities database, not just the very basic built-in database. So if I go for color grading, this should give me a lot more settings. They may not initially be exposed as node inputs that you can control, but there will potentially be a lot more settings in here you can change. So here we can change the exposure, which is essentially the brightness, gamma values, contrast. We can tweak mid-tones, blacks and whites. So we've got a lot of settings in here. This is now essentially the new filter shader, but for the node system. And once again, just to hammer the point home even, this is actually a giant collection of other nodes. If I convert this to just a regular group, and I then look inside that group of nodes, we will find we have all sorts. So it doesn't look too complicated here, but essentially someone has come along and they've strung together a whole series of hue, saturation, lightness nodes, split tone nodes, and indeed, look here, we have more arrows. There are groups in groups. So this split toning node isn't one of the basic ones. This is also an asset itself. If we look inside here, there's even more nodes which control things and tweak things. So now you can see our breadcrumbs are getting more and, well, essentially sort of deeper and deeper. So you can group groups, or to use some After Effects terminology, you can do a pre-comp with your node system. And yeah, if we have a look around here, maybe there's even a group within a group. Starting to get some real sort of inception stuff going on here. Now there isn't, but hey, there could have been. So let's go back to the color correction thing. Let's go back even further, all the way to the main node system. But hey, this is just presented to you as a nice, easy node system. It's up to you whether you want to sort of delve in and start changing it to that level of detail. Okay, so that will probably largely do us for the introduction on sort of how to make nodes. How you mix and combine, merge and change these things will be up to you, and there will be plenty of tutorials on how to do these because this is naturally quite a deep rabbit hole to go down. But let me just now finish off by showing you the various other little bits and pieces, the extra little icons around here which we haven't covered yet. So across our toolbar here, this is going to give you your grouping and ungrouping commands. These will, by the way, use the same shortcuts as you're used to in 3D. So if you do ever want to group something up, you can press Alt-G on your keyboard, and that will also group things up, but it's the same as the button you see over here. Let's see, let's not worry about port propagation. That's more of an advanced thing. That's how you can make your assets have nice, pretty interfaces, but we'll leave that for another time. We've got a duplicate command, which will take something and naturally duplicate it. Not really any different from you simply going copy and paste on your keyboard, so don't expect any miracles with it, but it's a nice little command, I guess. Select connected. Hey, if you want to just quickly select everything that this happens to be connected to, you can run the select connected command, bit of a tongue twister, and it will naturally select everything which has a line going down to it. Now these three here, these are actually quite useful. As your node system starts to get more and more complex, these will naturally start to take up quite a bit of space. So what you can do is have slightly different display modes. Right now we have the full display, show all the ports, show all the details. This will naturally take up a load of space, and you know what, if you're not using all these ports, really we're just wasting space. So you can squash it down a bit. Tell you what, let me just connect a few ports here so it's actually doing something. So this is the full display. If you go for the medium one, this will essentially hide any of these input and output ports which aren't used. So when we hit this one, oops, make sure you actually select the nodes you want it to change because it is per node. So okay, so let's try it again. So when we hit this middle one, everything starts to get a lot more compact. You can still see the thumbnail preview, and you will still see anything which is actually connected. So it's a sort of a fairly minimalist view, but you can go further still. If you want, if it's all sort of done, you can actually go for the basic view, which is just purely the thumbnail display on your node. Even more basic still though, it's not really an icon up here, but you can choose whether or not you actually get these thumbnails. So let me just go back to the full node for a moment. If you right click, in this menu you will see the option as to whether or not you're going to see the preview. So if we hide the preview, all our nodes will now just become essentially text only. Now this will potentially speed it up quite a bit if you've got hundreds of nodes. Keep in mind, Cinema has to generate previews for each and every step along the way. So hiding the preview could speed things up quite a bit. But if you did that and you compacted them, you would have a very, very simplified basic node display, and you might prefer this. Maybe you know that doubling the contrast, maybe you sort of mentally know what that will do, so you don't need to visually see it. This will give you a lot more space, and it will also make things noticeably quicker. But let's turn our previews back on, and again keep in mind this is per node, so you could just turn on the ones you actually care about, and all of the adding and subtracting and filtering, you could leave those nodes much more basic. Anyway, moving on. We are not going to worry about these two. These are, again, quite advanced. They let you choose where the start point for the node system will be. Not something we need to do right now. Removing unused nodes. Hey, we've got a few nodes here which don't really do anything. We could almost certainly lose the unused things. Stuff just floating around in space doing nothing, essentially. It's a cleanup tool. And next to it we also have the ability to remove unused ports. Do be careful with this one. The ports you tend to see exposed on a node are the ones which Maxon thinks are actually quite useful and you may very well need. If you remove everything which is unused, you're going to have to sort of go ahead and re-expose these ports on the node yourself. It's quite unlikely you'd want to do this too much. We've got options for the grid. Do you want the grid in the background? Take your pick. And then the option, of course, to snap to grid. This will allow you to go clunk, clunk, clunk and make nice, neat, lined up nodes if that's your cup of tea. It's not mine. Let's see. Don't worry about these. The navigator, that's this thing down in the corner. So as your node system gets more complicated, you might lose track of sort of where the nodes are. Perhaps I threw these nodes up into the corner. Now, if I've loaded the scene like this, I might assume this is it. This is everything I have in my project. I wouldn't necessarily know that these nodes are hiding up over there unless I just happen to zoom out. Well, we have this thing down in the corner. This is your navigator, and it's basically just a map. The whole box shows what is in the entire node system, and then this light grey box shows you where you're currently looking. So if I pan down into the corner, this is showing me what my view has. And it essentially lets me know, hey, there's something over there you might need to know about. And of course, it is draggable. You can move this thing around if you want to quickly navigate around a very large node system. Maybe you're sick and tired of panning in a 3D view. This one will let you just very quickly look around the entire place. And that will about do. There are a couple of extra icons for just laying things out. So if I select all, Control A or Command A on a Mac, there is the option to lay out your nodes and get Cinema to automatically arrange them for you. So if you're feeling sort of quite OCD and you want things all nicely laid out, all perfectly aligned, go for it. Use one of these automated layout tools. Okay, now the next thing to talk about would be searching. When you have a lot of nodes here, nodes there, nodes all over the place, let's make a mess again. Maybe you're not quite sure where the node is that you're looking for. Maybe you know, for example, that you have this shuffle node, which for the record, I have no idea what this does. But maybe you have it. And you're in your node system. It's quite large, it's quite sprawling, you're zoomed in, you're looking at all details, and you're thinking, where is that shuffle node in this giant rat's nest of wires? Well, make use of this search. This is a sort of a quick filter. Type in whatever you like up here, and as soon as you've typed a couple of letters, Cinema will grey everything out and only highlight things which match your search. So if I go for correction, as soon as I type C-O-R, there we go, I can now only see my correction nodes. So a very useful little thing there for quickly finding what it is you're looking for. But sticking on search for a moment, did you know Cinema has a command window? When you're working 3D, you can press Shift-C to bring up a very quick search. So if you're ever looking for a tool or an object or an ability, maybe I want to add a camera, you can just press Shift-C and then start typing. And there we go, here's my camera objects and my camera tools. We have something quite similar in the node system. It isn't the same keyboard shortcut for some reason, I'm not quite sure what that reason is, but rather than pressing Shift-C, you can just press C all by itself. So C is your node commander. And it's just a very quick way for you to search for something. So I'm over here, la 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 la, and I think, right, I need some sort of inverting node to do something. Just press C for your commander and then start typing away. Invert. There we go. We can invert colors or we can invert some mathematical formulas. And it works more or less the same way. Just select the item and in it jumps. But do keep in mind, when you're pressing C, it is in all reality just this window over here. But that leads me on to my next little suggestion. This all takes up quite a bit of space, leaving you only perhaps half, maybe 2/3 of the space left for the actual nodes themselves. Well, you don't have to have this here, and you don't have to have this here either. Now, this is going to list all your nodes. This is going to list various bits of information about it. And then the thing in the middle we've used quite a bit. This is where you find the nodes. You could quite possibly live a long, happy life without any of these items on the left. Keep in mind, nodes is a visual system. You can visually see what your nodes are and what they're doing. So this list of nodes you have is a little bit redundant. You don't, strictly speaking, really have to have this. And as for the information, it tells you what it's called, what it is, what the asset is called, what version you're using. Personally, I don't care. This means very little to me, and I imagine this will mean very little to everyone else. So you've got some tabs at the top. First of all, please keep in mind, you can just turn these tabs off. So I could hide the information, get some more space, and you know what, if I don't care about this list of nodes because, hey, I'm looking at them, you could turn those off as well, leaving with just this giant, nice big list of your assets. But what if we want even more space? Have a look over here. We've got some teeny tiny little icons in the corner. The first two, these allow me to turn on and off the left-hand bar and the right hand bar. So if I click this first icon, we can just completely remove that entire left hand side, leaving us with far more space. But if you want to take it a step further, you could also turn off the right hand bar and just have nothing but a gigantic, huge, spacious, luxurious node editor. But you're probably wondering, well, how do I now change my settings? Where's all the attributes gone? Here's the thing. When you turn off the right hand side, Cinema will now place all the settings in your regular full attributes editor. So when I select this invert color node here, I'll see the settings. When I work on a nice fresh new node material and I select the material itself, here are the settings for it. So this gives you some interesting abilities. If you're a little bit limited on screen space and you don't want to dedicate an entire screen just for your node system, you could dock this in. If you've never done this before, you see this little pad of dots up in the corner. You can drag and drop these onto existing little pads and it will create a series of tabs. So if I drag these pads here onto these pads here, there we go. We now have our node system docked into our main Cinema interface, and all the attributes for the things I select will appear down here in the corner. We can quickly switch between our main 3D view and our node view with these new tabs at the top. So for those who like their single screen, or you need your second or third screen for reference, email, or maybe timelines for animation, you could do this. This is a perfectly nice valid thing to do. Just turn off these two first icons and you can now use C for finding nodes and your settings will be in the corner. So this is something I may do myself personally. If you do find you need to have a quick extra large editor, rather than having to rip this thing out, you can just add an extra node editor. So much like your attributes and your object manager, this very last icon in the corner will give you an extra copy, and you can now have this giant, full-featured, full-fat node editor in your interface. So even if you do dock it in, you can quickly pop out a second copy if you need a bit more space still. So this node system is all very well and good, but what if this is just not your sort of thing? What if you're looking at this and thinking, you know what, I can see the power and I can see how this is all quite nice, but this is too much for me. Or rather, maybe you're thinking, well, I could make use of this on some really complicated, annoying materials. Maybe there's a few projects you've had in the past where some nodes would have really, really helped out. But this is overkill for just your normal everyday day-to-day stuff. Fear not. Because the node system is so new and powerful and flexible, we now have this new Uber material, which if you click on it, it will order you a taxi. No, the Uber material. The Uber material is the node system, but it's been presented to you as a regular, good old-fashioned cinema material. So rather than to deal with all those lines and squiggles and nodes and assets and everything else, if you're just looking for what is essentially a nice, fresh, brand new material, which isn't full of all this legacy junk. I mean, environment channels, that's pretty much junk. The fog channel, that was always a pile of trash ever since the start. Diffusion, we don't really use it anymore, maybe for a bit of ambient occlusion. Glow, again, that was always a bit of a dodo since the start. And even then, all the extra channels, they're just full of settings, legacy things, rarely used things. This is showing its age. It's showing that everything's been tacked on year after year. The Uber material is a brand new, fresh, slimline, cut-down material, which for the most part only shows you things you truly need to see. So let's go through, because this is a nice little, well, I say little, it's a powerful tool. Anyway, so starting at the top, we'll go down the list, I'll let you know what they do. So diffuse, this is essentially your color channel. Again, this is just a question of everybody else in the entire 3D industry. They don't call it the color setting or the color channel, they call it diffuse. This is how your material diffuses light across the surface. But it should look very familiar, hopefully. You can choose the color, you can choose how strong the color is. But wait a moment. Where's the texture slot? Where do I choose an image? Well, remember, this is node-based. So what you really do is you connect an image node. But Matthew, what are you doing? You just said we can avoid the node system. This is supposed to be the easy interface. It is. Have a look here. We have a new icon. This is the input icon. Or given that it's halfway between a square and a circle, we're going to call it the squircle. Everything has a squircle because every parameter, including the color of your material, can be driven by nodes. So the old-fashioned way of thinking of this would be the pull-down menu for shaders, where you might load gradients and noises and layers and other effects. Well, in this pull-down menu, you could always load an image. Well, that's what we basically do now with our Uber material. You click on this little squircle icon to the side, and it will give you the option to just very quickly load a texture. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's throw in, I don't know, a picture of a poppy. And there we go. So as soon as we do this, it hides away all the color settings and it just gives us our texture. If we do click on the texture, here are the settings. So if it's an animation, you can choose the frame rates. You can choose how it interprets the alpha channel, what layers to use. Yeah, all the same good old stuff. But if we go back, we can, in fact, do more powerful things. So you can treat this Uber material as just a nice, simple, basic material where you can load in textures, or you can use a node system for superpower, but you can actually get a rather nice halfway house. What if I want to apply a filter to my flowers? Or what if I just want to mix in some noise with my flowers? On this squircle icon, you can choose to add extra layers. So this will just add various noises or gradients into your system. Or you can replace it with something if you decide you didn't want the flower at all. Or show in node editor. The Uber material is a node material. You know how we took this simple noise and showed that it was essentially driven by, it can drive a more complex noise. You can push this even further. Rather than just packaging up a series of nodes as this asset in this list here, you can package up a series of nodes as an entire material. And in fact, that's what these guys are down here. All these gold materials and concrete and ceramic, these are node materials with dozens and hundreds of nodes, all packaged up and presented to you as a nice, happy, friendly material. But that does mean, because they're part of the node system, that if you want to add a bit of power just occasionally, you can show these items in the node editor, and you now have the full power of the node system feeding in to your Uber material. So if I suddenly decide, hey, I didn't want this flower, I wanted this noise effect, or I decided I'd actually like to merge a couple of these things together, you could go off and find the appropriate node, connect these various things together, and merge them all in simultaneously. So if I search, for example, let's see, if I search for layer, this will allow me to blend things together or lay them up, but maybe let's just go for a simple blend, and we'll simply get a couple of inputs. So I could very quickly reroute some noise and flowers into this blend, and then reroute that blending into my Uber material. And depending, of course, on the mix mode and the other settings we have, for example, let's say we're going to multiply them. Here we go. Here's my noise multiplied with my flower using a blend node, and that then feeds into the Uber. And when I'm done with this, when I'm finished, I can just simply close it out, and here we go. I can see that the diffuse of my Uber material is controlled with this multiplied blend. But if you wish, you don't even have to look at the node system to do this. When I click on my blend set to multiply mode, it will show me the things which are controlling it. So let's just grab a fresh Uber material for a moment. So if I start off clicking on the squircle and I just search straight away for blend, let's see, we have our blend node. I can click onto the blend, again, much in the same way that I might have previously added a layer shader to the standard legacy materials. But I can now click on blend, and I have the option for my two inputs, which currently are just black and white colours, but they can be pictures. So I could blend together in the foreground, click on the new squircle. I could load a texture of a flower, and for my background, I could load in a leaf, and I can now merge these together. Again, let's just go for multiply, but I've now got my sort of poppy flower and my green leaf merging together, and I haven't had to, as far as I'm concerned, visually, I haven't had to touch a single node. But what I have secretly been doing behind the scenes is, if we show the node editor, is we have gone ahead and connected all this stuff together. Here's our nodes. Let's just pop these around the right way. Here's our blend, and here's our Uber material again. So you can have all the power of the node system without touching a single node. I mean, you are secretly, but you don't have to visually see them. So let's move on down our list and see what we've got. So what we have is a reflection channel, and just before I mention this fully, we also have a coating channel. Now remember, all of this stuff is just a series of BSDF layers. This diffuse is just a very, very soft diffused reflection. This reflection here is just quite a soft glossy reflection. And this coating channel is just a very shiny reflection. So the Uber material is effectively driven by 3 reflection layers. But in most cases, 99% of cases, if not higher, these 3 reflections is normally enough to create the surface you want. I just try to think of any surface off the top of your head which has more than 3 visible layers all simultaneously. I mean, with this, we could do car paint with metallic flakes and then a clear coat over the top. How much more complicated are you in a typical day of work? How much more complicated are you going to get? So, your reflection channel. Naturally, choose how strong the reflection is. How rough is it going to be? It's quite a soft, diffuse, just makes it a little bit bigger. It's quite a soft, diffuse reflection by default. If I turn the roughness down, you'll see it naturally get sharper and crisp. So, I mean, strictly speaking, nobody says this has to be rough and this has to be shiny. You could do it the other way around if you wish. But yeah, you can choose how rough the surface is, what kind of BSDF type it uses, although in all reality, you're not going to get much of a difference by changing this outside of the anisotropy, but we'll save that for another time. You've got your Fresnel settings, which are nicely turned on by default. Remember, every reflection on a surface does technically use this Fresnel, where it fades out the fronts and gives you a very strong reflection on the edges. And these are turned on by default. And the default setting is, to be brutally honest, it's quite passable for almost every single substance you want. You're not going to get much difference between switching between this thing being made of pearl or being made of sapphires. You know, there's really not going to be visually much difference. The index of refraction here, the IOR, this just determines how the shininess fades out between the front of the surface and the side. But as I say, in all likelihood, you're not going to notice that much difference between any of these different values. In fact, it almost kind of visually just looks like a different strength. So you could more or less do much for the same thing by just changing the intensity, or even just changing the color which it uses. Speaking of which, just before I go any further, Have you noticed maybe that this grayscale colour slider here is very bright? There's not many dark shades. All the dark shades are shoved on the left-hand side. That is because we are using linear colour space. If you're not a fan of this, if you'd rather get back the old traditional grayscale gradient because you think, oh, I need some dark shades, that's what this new icon here does. Linear colour. If we turn this off, you'll get your old-fashioned colour sliders, which you might find more comfortable to use. But just keep in mind, this might start to monkey around with your colour spaces if you start mixing it in with extra images and layers and all the rest of it. Okay, so here's your general reflection. And next up here, here's your coating. This will be a nice, shiny, glossy, see-through layer on the outside edge. So it's really pretty much the same as a reflection. So this is really just for a nice, glossy outer layer. But the settings are pretty much the same. So hopefully these, by the way, are a lot easier and more straightforward than this mountain of settings you may be used to from your traditional reflectance layer, which has tons and tons and tons of stuff in it, which we really didn't care too much about. Moving on down, we have emission, which is just the new name for luminance. Again, nothing scary in here. Choose a color, choose a brightness, or if you'd like to emit an image like a mobile phone screen or a TV screen, once again, just load the texture in through the squircle icon and load in your texture there. Transparency, again, more or less the same. This will all be grayed out until we actually enable the setting. So when we turn this on, how transparent, how frosted and blurry should it get? And down here, absorption. So this is really sort of 99% the same as the old material system. So I won't waste any time in here going through these settings. If you need to know what these do, please go look at the old settings for the old material because they're exactly the same. Opacity, this is just our new name for alpha channel. Not quite sure why they chose to rename this one, because if we do take a look at a node material, it is called alpha here. So slight head scratch on that one. We'll let them off though. So opacity, again, this is just going to be whether or not it uses transparency. But do keep in mind, Cinema will pick up automatically transparency if your texture happens to have some. So for example, if I make a nice fresh new Uber material and I happen to have a tree with some built-in transparency as a PNG file laying around, we should be able to just drop this onto our input and that will load it in. And if we were to turn on opacity, we can tell this transparency system, just load in how transparent all of my layers are. Essentially turn on layer opacity, and whatever we're using for our emission or reflection or diffusion, it will just pick up all of that data and automatically apply it. So you no longer have to apply the same PNG file in your diffuse as you do in the opacity, because the opacity, so long as you actually tell it to use the layers, it will just pick that information up automatically. If you do want to override it, if you do have a specific image you would wish to use as your mask, once again, the value of the opacity, you can load in an image to control it. And I should mention, by the way, keep in mind, everything has this squircle icon. So just going back for a moment, if you'd like to control how blurry your transparency is, the blurriness can be driven by an image. If you were to load in a black and white image, you could say all the white areas are blurry, all the black areas are crisp. Or how much light it absorbs. You can drive that by texture. So essentially everything, even something as basic as a color slider, you could control how reflective the glass is with a picture. You could even control the index of refraction, how much it bends light through a texture. That might give you some weird and wacky results. Maybe you could do something cool like a shimmering heat wave from a jet engine. That might be possible. I don't know. I haven't given it a go, but give it a go and let me know. Okay, so moving down then, so that's your opacity. Bump map, same as it ever was. Again, keep in mind there's no slot to load in a texture because the value which we use to choose how bumpy it is just the very, very first setting. Click the squircle, load a texture, that's how you get your bump map in. And once again, You've got a nice strength slider there to choose how strong it's going to be. The normal channel, that's the same as it's ever been. Once again, load in a texture and all the rest is the same. Let's not dwell on there too long though. And again, pretty much the same for displacement. Just load in your texture and then you've got the typical settings of how strong it should be, how high up and down the actual displacement should go, sub-poly displacement. You may notice we've lost a few settings here, and that is because predominantly we don't really need them. So your sub-poly displacement is still available along with the round geometry, and then naturally how much it divides it up. So pretty much we just have a nice new trimmed down streamlined texture. And that is the Uber material. As well as the Uber material, we also have some extra node materials down here. So in the same way that the Uber material is the node system and it's just being created through the nodes but presented in a nice, happy, neat, familiar way, so too are the new node materials down here. So these have been made to be actually used and also as examples of the sort of thing which can be done by yourselves. So let's take, for example, something like the marble material. We're not going to go through all of these. Once I've shown you one or two, you should hopefully get the gist of what they're for. The marble material is its own brand new material. So rather than listing the sort of traditional diffuse, reflection, emission, bump, opacity, we get some marble specific settings. What is the basic color of the marble supposed to be? How many veins, what sort of size, what sort of intensity should these veins have running through the marble surface? How shiny and glossy should the reflection be? So let's have a nice shiny glossy marble reflection. Let's make it maybe not quite so rough. And then you've got things like deformation. Do you want to see the veins and sort of various imperfections and dents actually chipping into the surface? And how much variation should there be? If you're going to use multiple marble materials, you don't want them to all have the exact same pattern swirling on the side. If we change the seed value, even just by 1, that will give us a completely different marble pattern. And you can just keep cycling and scrolling through these until you happen to get a marble pattern which suits your desires. But as I say, these are in actual fact just node materials. If we were to look at this inside the node editor, here is the big fat marble material. That's very wide. But as I say, it's an asset, just like all the others we've used before. If you wanted, you could convert this asset into a group, jump inside the group, and we'll find there's even more groups inside with even more settings. And this, let's get a bit of space in here, shall we? Bum, ba, bum, ba, bum. Let's hide the left, let's hide the right. This is the marble material. So it's just a giant collection of nodes, various noises, various patterns doing all sorts of things, but they're all being presented to you in a nice, happy, tidy way. And more or less the same thing goes with all of the other materials you see down here. These are all made for doing quite specific things. The cutout material, this is specifically for rendering cardboard cutout shapes very fast. In fact, literally the only setting it has is what file should it use. There are no other settings on this, and as a result, it will render relatively a lot faster. It will use much less memory when it actually comes to render this out. But again, other examples, let's see what we've got in here. So the car paint, this is sort of traditionally one of the main things you would use the node system for. In here you can choose your base car paint color. Let's go for a nice sexy purpley blue. How many sort of metallic flakes we're going to see on the surface, and how strong they are and how large they are. So depends how close you want to get to the surface, and then what color the sort of final gloss should be on the outside. But this is designed to be a super easy material, so easy it almost certainly won't be mentioned in the manual with every single setting, because these can be updated and improved. More and more materials can be added. The idea is it's so simple you don't need much of a manual in order to use this. But that's it. That's just the extra friends to go along with the Uber material. So go through these, have an experiment. Don't be put off if you've sort of been stung by these old materials in here, all of the Banjis and the Banzis and the Danels, these by comparison are absolute garbage. At the time they were made, they were fine, so no insult to the person who made them, but 20 years later, they're incredibly out of date. So if you've been stung by these and thought, oh, what a waste they were, no, these materials down here are all actually quite good. They're all actually quite nice. And as with the others, you can fully drive every single parameter you see in here by loading in either extra nodes or loading in some sort of image. And that's about it. The one final little tip I've got on here, by the way, just whilst we're in here, is these previews. There is a new preview. If you right click, called Object. In fact, actually, there's a few new ones. There's a candle if you're trying to investigate subsurface scattering. There's cloth if you're trying to see how your cloth texture shimmers across a nice smooth surface. So we could have some metallic car paint on cloth, or we could even have a metallic car paint candle. That would be a bit of an odd choice to do, though. But the one I want to just quickly mention is just down at the bottom here. Object. This one is quite nice for just testing things. You can see various results on how it looks on a flat part of a surface, curved parts, thin parts. This object preset is quite a nice preset to use. And in fact, it's so nice, if you want, jump into your preferences, search for material, and you will be able to find an option for what the default material looks like. The default is a sphere, but do feel free to use something else or this nice new object, because that is my personal preference. I think these make for quite nice little material balls. Okay, onwards we go then. So the last area for me to mention for the nodes before we do some examples is really just a collection of little hints and tips and just general advice. My first bit of general advice, and the first, I guess, bit of general information, you need to keep in mind these Uber materials and these node materials, these will be really slow to render. That is for a good reason though, and don't worry, I will show you how to speed things up. The more experienced amongst you will know that in your render settings, you can add effects such as global illumination. Global illumination is just the ability to bounce light from one surface to another, to make luminant materials cast light, and to allow a sky shining down onto your scene to illuminate everything in the project. And this, of course, does slow rendering down quite considerably. Like this will make your rendering easily 5 times slower, or if you turn on some fancy settings, you can get sort of 10 or 20 times slower on your rendering. So the first thing to make you aware of, your node material system has global illumination built in. If you're using this node system, you do not need to enable GI. And in fact, you shouldn't, because you'll just be doing the same calculation twice. If I go for a new project and I create a node material, and we'll just leave it there, quite simple. And we throw in our nice little happy stick figure here, chuck our node material on. So long as I have some sort of luminant object, and by the way, do feel free to mix and match the old traditional materials with node materials. So long as you make use of the same kind of system, the reflectance BSDFs, you can actually mix and match them perfectly fine. They do control the same render engine after all. So just to be really lazy, you could throw a standard legacy material in and just pop on some luminance, if you're feeling really lazy. But this cube will illuminate my little stickman down here. But it doesn't look like it does. So if you are going to use this, you just got to keep in mind, Cinema has this default light, a light which is always shining down on the scene so you can see what you're doing in the editor. Cinema doesn't really know that we're trying to illuminate our project with these luminant objects. So long as you jump into your render settings, come down to options, and you turn off the default light. There we go. All you'll be left with now is this. So when I hit render, this cube will illuminate the scene. So effectively, this is global illumination. Or if I were to add a sky object and place, oops, let's open this material up. So again, I'm just going to use an old material for this, just to show that they can be mixed and matched. If I were to load in some sort of HDRI in here, let's grab just one I always use for all my quick tests, the good old-fashioned kitchen, although of course others are available. Here's the kitchen. We'll throw this thing on, chuck it onto the sky, and here we go. Our image wrapped around on the sky will now illuminate him. But we're doing all of this with no global illumination because, as I say, global illumination is inherently built in as the way that the node material system works. So first of all, really huge advantage, no more global illumination settings to worry about, it's always just there. But at the same time, huge disadvantage. You're now going to get lots of slow renders because global illumination is now always turned on. So beyond that, my first proper hint is you can turn this behavior off. And whilst you're first getting into the node material system, you may wish to do this because you're going to be doing lots of tests. When you start a new project, down in the corner where you can normally choose the frame rate for the project, default colors and so on, at the very bottom we have a new setting. Use color channel for node materials. And this basically means when making the base diffuse layer, don't use these reflectance-based diffuse layers. Use the old-fashioned color channel, which renders really fast, but doesn't have global illumination built in. So if we turn this on, so it's in your project settings if you've already lost this page. So if we turn on use color channel for node materials, our node system will now act just like the old material system. If I have our little stick figure in here and I apply a node material to him, and there is a sky shining down with a texture illuminating everything. Again, we'll just go for the kitchen. This basically won't do anything anymore. It's not going to illuminate anything, even if I turn off the default light setting. In fact, if I do that, it'll probably just go pitch black. Yeah, there we go, like that. So it does mean we can now use our own global illumination settings. So if there's a particularly fast setting that you like to use, myself, I quite like to go for the interior preview with a high diffuse depth. And then under light mapping, I turn on build radiosity maps. This gives you quite a fast cached global illumination system. You may find you're going to get faster, cleaner results with this rather than the sort of grainy progressive rendering that you get with the node system. But as I say, this is a choice. This is up to you. We are intending, I guess, for you to not turn this setting on, but I feel it's quite important that you know it is an option that's available. So if you're looking to do more fast motion graphics where you need render times of 10 or 20 seconds per frame and you can't afford to wait 5 minutes, turn this on and your entire node system is now going to be suddenly much more usable for you. But with that said, if you are going to stick with the node system in its standard regular mode, which is really what it's designed to do, you are probably better off using Cinema's physical render engine. The standard render engine is not very good at clearing up noise. If I throw in this luminant object here to the side, and again we'll just make it sort of nice and bright, we'll just throw some luminance on this thing, and let's turn off the automatic light, otherwise we know this doesn't work. You will get quite a grainy image, and the only way traditionally to clean up a grainy image if you're using standard render is to crank up the anti-aliasing up to best mode. It's still quite grainy. Let's zoom in over here. Quite grainy, quite slow. So I have no choice. I'm going to have to boost my anti-aliasing up to maybe sort of 4x4 and 8x8. And my render times will now shoot through the roof. And even then, it's still a relatively grainy image. So you are generally much better off switching over to Cinema's physical render engine. With physical render, it's really designed for cleaning up grain. So under physical, just because we're doing tests, we'll set our physical render engine to the adaptive, sorry, no, not adaptive, that's the default, to the progressive sampler. This is great for doing tests, just in case you're not aware, because it will render the entire image, boom, and then keep on cleaning it up the longer that you leave it. So there we go. The physical engine is quite a good combination when using the node system. I almost certainly wouldn't use standard unless I'm going to be turning on that sneaky, cheating little use color channel for node material option down here. My other bit of advice is just regarding multipass. If you're the kind of person who enjoys throwing in multipass renderings with all of the nice highlights and shadows and reflection layers, I'm afraid there's a little bit of bad news for you. Because reflection is now fundamentally how everything is created, we're going to lose a lot of ability in terms of these channels. I can't really split out my reflection from my refraction. I can't split my diffuse lighting out quite as well as I could from my other kind of lighting. So what you've got down here is some new multipass channels. Direct and indirect diffuse, and then direct and indirect specular highlights. These are going to give you back some of the abilities you have up here. Not all of them, but it will bring it back to being usable. Basically, these two here, direct and indirect diffuse. This is things which have been lit directly, and then things which have been lit via a bounce. So, if I had a room, and this room had some walls. I'm not going to tell you how to do this. This is not a modelling tutorial, but I will include the scene file if you like. So here's our little room, and it's just going to simply be a Uber material applied to the whole thing. And as far as lighting goes, as far as materials go, we'll have a basic white diffuse layer, and then we'll keep this sort of a soft sheen reflection bouncing off the surface. If I chuck in a light source with some shadows, we'll just go for a hard shadow, keep it nice and simple. And we pop this light over here on one side of the wall. Okay, so I'm going to render this thing out with physical render because that's going to do a much better job. We'll leave it set to adaptive mode so it finishes and it just doesn't keep on endlessly rendering. And then we'll turn on multipass. I'll just turn on all 4 of these new diffuse and specular layers down here. So when we render this thing out, off we go, render, render, render. We'll leave it quite grainy because who wants to sit around waiting? Doesn't matter for this demonstration. So in here, if I go to my layers, what you're going to find is the direct diffuse is essentially sort of like a standard, bog standard render. These are the parts which the light has directly, hint hint, the word direct, which has been directly illuminated and where they're soft diffuse layers. The indirect diffuse will effectively be what the global illumination does. This will be all of your bounced lighting which ricochets around. Specular is going to be reflection. There's a bit of a the words have been a little bit mangled up so that they don't mean exactly what they used to. Specular used to just be shiny glossy reflections but of light sources. Well, now we're using the word specular to mean sort of reflected glossy sheens bouncing around. So the direct specular will be literally the reflection of the light bulb, so that's sort of as you know it. But the indirect specular will be the glossy reflections. So through these 4 channels, we can now have the direct light, the indirect soft diffuse global illumination, specular highlights, and reflections as we sort of traditionally know them all the separate layers. So hopefully that will bring back a lot of the layers and a lot of the use you previously had. Keep in mind, all of the other layers will continue to work. We can still have ambient occlusion layers and transparency layers and caustics if you want to use these things. Okay, so that was the other big hint. The other couple of little bits left which didn't happen to get mentioned whilst I was going through the system was just that in your node system, this little checkerboard icon here, this will allow you to quickly toggle on and off the preview, just in case you want to speed things up or make them more compact. And this guy will allow you to solo things. So, for example, let's say my material here has a couple of BSDF input layers. One of these is a blue color, and the other one will load in a texture. Let's see, let's go back. Let's just throw in another road sign. Let's go for some radioactivity. But we'll, oops, get out of the way. We'll just sort of tone down how strong this one is so we can see some of the blue coming through. What if I want to see just one of these inputs? What if I want to see just what one of these things is going to look like? Well, don't worry, that's fine. We can. When the material is applied to your object, we can solo a layer. So we can look at just the blue, or just the radioactivity, or if you've got multiple inputs, maybe there's some noise, some scratches, some textures. Each of these can also be soloed, so it's the only thing which affects it. But yeah, turn the little S on and off, and you can choose whether or not all the other layers are temporarily, for a moment, disabled and not getting in the way. Right, I think that will do for the tips. Actually, no, sorry, there is one last little teeny tiny thing I just want to mention. It's not really a tip, it's more just a bit of information, probably for the more advanced people. Texture interpolation. On a traditional legacy material, when you load a texture in, we'll go for this, you always have this bit here which says sampling, and it almost always, unless you've changed it, it almost always says MIP. Sampling is how cinema deals with a high resolution texture which gets squashed into a very small area. So by that I mean this warning sign we have. If my cube, this texture is 1,000 pixels wide, but what if this object is far away in the distance? Cinema has to squash 1,000 pixels of texture into maybe just 100 pixels of final image. Or what if the angle is very, very acute, so we're just sort of glancing across the top like this? Well, again, we've got to take sort of 900 pixels of texture and squash it into 100 pixels of space. This is handled with sampling, and the default used to be something called MIP. This was okay, it was very fast, it was very memory efficient, but it had a big disadvantage. When a texture went on its edge, so let me just pop this in luminance so it's a bit easier to see. When a texture went on its edge like this, it would lower the resolution down so that there wasn't such a high res being crammed into such a tiny space. But the downside is that this tended to make very, very soft, blurry reflections. So the solution traditionally was to use SAT mapping. SAT mapping used more memory, it was a little bit slower, but it gave you crisper results. Well, we now have a new default. Your node system, and your node system only, you will not find this in the old material, but your node system will default to a system we now call RIP. So we've now got MIP, RIP, and SAT. And basically, RIP is virtually as good as the SAT mapping, but it doesn't go blurry. So just in case some more advanced people were using those different interpolation modes and you were wasting a lot of memory and rendering time with SAT mapping, I can advise you don't waste your time with it anymore. Just leave it set to the new default of RIP mapping and you will end up with lots of nice, crisp, detailed textures. Anyway, that's the last little hint from me. So for the basic intro to Node, that's us done. Let's go investigate some example projects, shall we? Okay, so in this first example, we're going to try and make ourselves a nice, fairly standard surface, maybe something like a brick wall, but we're going to try and do it really well, and we're going to do it through the node system, obviously. So down here, let's make ourselves a new node material. Let's go inside and see what we have. So what we're going to need for this is obviously some sort of brick texture. But typically you'd also have some sort of corresponding bump map or normal map or displacement map. But we're going to try and sort of make all of these through the node system through just a single image. So a good place for grabbing textures, just in case this is new to you, would be somewhere like textures.com. This is absolutely filled with loads of really nice, useful textures. So if we jump on over to the brick category, and we say, well, obviously you can go ahead and choose whatever you like, but I'll be grabbing some modern brown bricks, just a fairly sort of standard brick wall texture. Interesting adverts. Okay, so I've already actually gone ahead and grabbed one or two of these. So that's where you can find some yourself. We will include the ones we use, so do have a look with your downloaded files if you just want to use the same images we use. But here is our brick texture. So we're just going to drag this into our node window, drop it in there. And this is, of course, going to make the sort of basis of our brick wall. So here's our material, here's our first layer, and we'll go ahead and just connect that straight on into our brick. So there we go, we've now got the basics. But for this brick wall, we're also going to want some sort of a bump map. But as you may remember from my introduction, we don't really have a bump channel anymore. We've just got this normal. So it's really up to us to create the image we want to use as a bump and then convert that bump image into a normal map. So traditionally your bump maps are going to be these grayscale images. Now you don't have to have this as a grayscale image to be a bump map, but it will sort of visually help us work out what's happening and therefore tweak it later. So I need a grayscale version of this. And rather than firing up Photoshop and tweaking it there and bringing it back in as yet another file, we can do all of this just within our node system. So if I search down here for something which is going to affect the color, we do have the sort of great big powerful color grading node. This would do the job, that's okay. But all of these settings is a little bit overkill for just trying to strip out the color from this image. So keep in mind that the simpler the node is, the faster Cinema will be able to render it, the less memory it will take up. So we're not going to use this great big powerful color grading node, we're just going to go for something simple. If we go for color correction, this is a simple color, saturation and brightness shifter. So if we wire this into our system here, let's pop this down here, in we go. We can now take this and simply knock off all the saturation of the image, so we end up with a grayscale image. Cool. But the first thing I'm looking at this and realizing is it's going to be the wrong way around. Traditionally in a bump image, the white parts will come upwards and the dark parts will go down. So in this case, all of our grout in between the bricks would be sticking out, and that's not very good bricklaying. It's supposed to be slightly inset. So we're going to need to invert this image. So let's have a search for invert. Here we go. Keep in mind there is a invert node for doing mathematical equations. This would make positive numbers negative essentially. And there is also one for switching colors. So we're going to go for the invert color. We'll drop it over here, and can we drop it into the output node of our color correction? Okay, so it's asking us which port it should connect into, so yellow goes to yellow generally. And there we go. So we can do that with just one click and drag, although arguably having to choose which channel it connects to might slow you down more than just drawing the wire yourself. So swings and roundabouts, eh? Okay, so this will now invert it. So we had dark bricks and white grout. we now have dark grout and light bricks. So that's much better for our bump. But there's not much contrast here. The bricks don't really get to white and the grout doesn't really get to black. So I also want to boost the contrast on this. So contrast, here we go, a color node which affects contrast. We'll pop that there. We'll just quickly wire it up ourselves. I think that's actually a little bit quicker. But we do now have a contrast slider. So we can boost how much contrast is in this image. And that will be better for driving our bump. Okay, so we've essentially at this point got the image we want to use for our bump map, but as I mentioned, we don't really have a bump input on our node system. So we need to convert our color information, this yellow node, into some vector information with this purple node. And that just simply means searching down here for bump. And by the way, don't forget your command window. You don't have to keep coming over here for your items on the side. You can just press the letter C on your keyboard and search for the items you need in here. So bump, there we go. Here's our bump converting node. But this will convert our grayscale bump image into a nice pinky purple vector normal map. So if we zoom out, pop this over here, get a bit more space, we can of course connect up our nice new normal map with its purple node into the normal channel of our brick. But possibly we don't want to do this. We will, as we go on with this brick texture, we will be adding more layers. We'll add a general level of reflection to our brickwork. We'll maybe add some sort of dirt or grit or maybe some graffiti on top of it. So if we do this and make this one brick layer have the normal map, we would have to wire this into every single normal map of every single channel, because all of the other surfaces would also have this same level of sort of bumpiness to them. So let's not wire this into just one single layer. Let's wire this directly into the entire material. And it does also give me a chance to show you how you can pull wires out. So you don't have to delete this wire with a double click and then rewire it over here. What you can do is you can actually pull these wires out. If you click and drag on the wire near to a port, it will allow you to drag it out. So you can sort of reroute this thing anywhere you like. Just drag the wire and reroute it over to the normal of the entire material. Okay, so we've now got our sort of a rough, bumpy brickwork. But it's super matte. There's no glossiness to it. There's no shine. Now, a lot of bricks aren't traditionally shiny and glossy, but there will be some level of reflection to it. You will see a bit of sheen coming off these bricks. So it's time for us to add a new layer. With our material at the end here, let's come over to this add button, but let's not hit add because that just adds a blank empty input, which is not much use. We're just going to go for the pull down menu and specifically tell Cinema we would like a new BSDF node. So in we go. Here is our new extra layer. So this is going to be the general glossiness. Now, these materials, these layers will always default to being this sort of soft, diffuse material. So we're going to need to change this to be something much shinier, much more glossy. So on the BSDF type, and make sure you are selecting the right node here. We want to change this new one, not the old brick. But on this new node, change the BSDF type from a flat matte diffuse into a shiny glossy Beckman. And we've seen this before. It will initially turn the entire thing into this bright reflective chrome surface. So sure, we do want a reflection, but obviously we don't want it to be this reflective. So we've got a roughness slider. This will allow us to choose, obviously, how rough the surface will be. So we'll just add a little bit. We might want to sort of come back and play around with this later. But if we say for now maybe 10% roughness, or maybe a bit more, 20% roughness, again, possibly even a little bit more, but we'll leave it here for now. We can always come back and tweak this. This will give us a bit of shininess to our brick, but currently it's everywhere. It's giving us this super shiny metallic brick surface. So we need to tone down how metallic it is. And your two choices are to either go to the very final material and say to it, hey, this Beckman reflection we added, could you just tone this down so it's not quite so strong? But this will just put an even amount of shiny glossiness absolutely everywhere on top of the surface. This is not really how materials react. Remember the Fresnel thing with the book cover. Reflective surfaces will be glossier on the outside edges than they are in the middle. And if we put our Beckman back up to full, that is what we can do with our shiny Beckman's Fresnel settings. So of the two choices you've got, we go for dielectric. Remember, conductors are really only for metallic surfaces. So go for dielectric, which is essentially everything else. And this gets us a long way there. In fact, practically this has us all the way there. We do have some choices for what type of surface it is. Unfortunately, it just doesn't really have much in there that's of much use to us. I mean, we can choose between beer, glass, milk. This is unfortunately predominantly transparent things. There's not really many solid surfaces in here. But don't worry about it too much. These presets, they're really just changing the index of refraction, how much the light changes based on the angle. And these values, the lowest they tend to go is 1.4. And the highest they generally tend to go is about 1.6. But if you watch my previews up here, when I change it between the highest and the lowest values, there's really not much difference. It's just a very slight tweak on how bright it goes at the edges. So to be brutally honest, I would tend to just leave this right at the default because it just doesn't make that much appreciable difference. It's barely worth spending your time on. So there we go. This is the general glossiness of my brick. I might just come back to it and add a little bit more roughness still. Maybe let's go for 30% because this brick is obviously not supposed to be that glossy. So we just want a bit of a shine on the edge. And of course, feel free, by the way, right click on these and choose what size or even what shape would help you with the preview. Perhaps a huge rounded cube would be a pretty good default. So now you can see how shiny and glossy it is in different directions. But do feel free to experiment with these different shapes. Anyway, so there we go. So we've got our general sort of a slightly shiny brick. And if you still think it is a little bit too shiny, by the way, remember you can always select the layer, or rather you can select the final material, and you can still pull down the strength of this reflection. So maybe we only want this at sort of 3/4 strength, or even a little bit lower. We just want a slight little reflection on the edge of this. Okay, so there's the basic brick, but let's continue with this. Let's continue pushing this further. What if we want something on top of the brick? Now, I should just say, just before we do this, you can continue to use Cinema's traditional layering system. We can pop this brick texture onto a surface and then add a new separate material and drop that on top of it afterwards. But we're going to try and do this purely in our node system. So let's just make sure this all fits. There we go. So let's continue adding these extra substances. So let's say there's a bit of graffiti on top of this brick wall. Again, you can jump on over to textures.com, and if we search for some graffiti, is it 1T or 2? We'll see. 1T. Okay, cool. So we can go through here and sort of choose some sort of image we want for our graffiti on the surface. Something like this would be quite good because what we're really looking for is actually to create some sort of alpha channel. So we could do with a nice sort of solid black and solid white image, which lets us lay things on top. So this both guy, I think that's what it says, we'll go for this. So again, I've already downloaded this one. You'll find it included with the scene files. So if we just grab this in our textures, here is our graffiti. Let's throw Mr. Both into our node editor. So with this, we will of course need a new material for this surface. So let's add another BSDF layer. Here it is. This will be our paint. Now, what we want to do with this is just use this as an alpha channel for some paint color. So, for example, on this new layer, diffuse is fine. We've got to select what color the paint is. That's fine. And we can choose the color over here to the side. So maybe let's go for a nice hot pink. Mr. Both is strong, yet he's in touch with his feminine side. So there's the pink, but you can obviously see it's just going to cover everything up. We do get to keep the bumpiness because we fed our bump and normal into the material, but it's completely covered up with brick colours. So we need to cut this out. Now here's one big change you need to be aware of in the node system compared to standard materials. The colour information, the red, green, blue, is all entangled up now with the alpha channel. So whether it's transparency colour or colour, it's all one in the same thing. So if the image I used had a transparency layer, if you could see the checkerboard behind this image, and we connected this in, that would drive the transparency and you would only see this graffiti layered up on top of the material. Unfortunately, this image we've got is just a JPEG and it doesn't have any transparency information. So again, we could take this into Photoshop, select the white area, delete it, save it back out as a file format which does support transparency, like TIFF, Targa or PNG. But we're going to try and just stick within our node editor window. So how do we give this a transparency? Or an alpha channel rather? Well, fear not. If you search down in your assets for alpha, you will find there's quite a few, various ones for tweaking and blending and doing things with it. But this thing at the moment doesn't actually have an alpha channel. So no matter how much I tweaked it and changed it around, it wouldn't really do anything. So what we need to do is we actually need to create an alpha channel in the first place. And we can do this with our set alpha node. If we drop this in, it will ask you for an RGB image, so this will be the color information, and then it's also asking you for some alpha data. Now just note that these things have different colors on the inputs. The RGB is yellow, we always use yellow for sort of color information, and the alpha channel port is gray. This is because Cinema is expecting just some grayscale value in order to set the alpha. Now, you don't have to follow these color guides. So it is entirely possible for me to just input this black and white image, even though it's full RGB, hence the yellow. It is entirely possible to feed this just straight into the alpha channel, and that will work. Cinema will quietly internally convert color information into grayscale values if you need it to. That's why we get this slightly strange little symbol. We get this little dot in the center. This is letting us know that Cinema has made a decision about how it should convert things. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just telling us, hey, this isn't technically the right kind of data, so I'm going to try and do something useful for you. And in this case, it's worked perfectly fine. So we now have this node here with alpha data. If we feed this into our final destination, it's not doing much here because we haven't actually set the RGB yet. But if we go all the way to the end, you can see we now have our brickwork back and it's showing the logo, but it's obviously not quite doing it right. So the first issue we've generally got is for an alpha channel, you should really have solid black and solid white data, maybe with a few in between shades for anti-aliasing. But you want solid black and white. And you can see here, once it's been converted into an alpha, it isn't. The logo isn't solid black, hence you can still see a bit of the grid through it. And this white isn't white, it's just a shade of grey, hence it hasn't gone perfectly see-through. So what we want to do is we want to sort of crank up the contrast on this graffiti. So let's go ahead and throw in another contrast node. And by the way, when you're dragging these in, we can just drop these straight onto the wire and it will insert it for us. That's kind of cool. I like that behavior. So this gives us a chance to crank up the contrast. And as we do this, our alpha node should sort of flood in with more sort of solid black and white, but it's not quite done it. We do still have a bit of a grayscale gradient in the background here, which the contrast can't quite fix. So we're also going to need a bit of a brightness shift. So if I search for brightness, we can possibly use our color correction node here. Let's link that in there. And with this, we can hopefully just tweak the value, which is pretty much brightness anyway. And if we watch the sort of the final result over here, so I'm tweaking this node, but I'm watching what it does over here. So as I change the brightness, and this is all interactive, you haven't got to let go of the mouse. As I boost the brightness, you can see it's sort of flooding with far more black and white. And I'm just going to keep going until we get that nice solid black and solid checkerboard, I guess, that background. So cool. So we've got a decent alpha channel here, but if you look at our final material, it's the wrong way round. We can only see the brickwork where the graffiti is rather than the opposite. So we're going to need to invert this. And yep, you've already guessed it. We've already done this once or twice before. So let's search for an invert node. Let's invert the color. We'll just pop that down there. I can't quite see the wire. We'll have to pop this in manually. So let's give ourselves a little bit more space. Let's zoom one out, pop these over here, and the final thing we need to do to this thing down here is to invert the color. There we go. So we'll reroute it through there. So we've now got, let's see, is this working? Oh, actually, we may need to place the invert somewhere else. Keep in mind, this will be inverting the color information as well as the alpha channel. So perhaps this isn't the best place to put it. Maybe let's insert this thing before it goes into the alpha setting node. So let's pop that there, pop that there. So we're rerouting through here. So yeah, so we've now inverted it and then we're setting the alpha channel. This way we've got a transparent background and a more solid text. You can still see it is a little bit see-through, so we may need to play around with our contrast and our color correction nodes a little bit more, perhaps. Let's tweak that a little bit. Is that going to help? Yeah, there we go. That's better. Okay, so and we can now finally pop this into our paint color, and we have our graffiti sitting on top of the brickwork. So just to sort of quickly recap, we've taken our graffiti, we've color corrected it to boost how bright it is. We need to get this white background up to pure white, basically. We've then cranked up the contrast with the contrast node to make it black and white, not grey and white. We can then invert it. It's a little bit imperfect down there, but let's not worry about that just for now. And then finally, we're going to sort of insert this into the alpha channel and then feed it into our layer. So you may notice, hold on, our bright, lovely pink is gone. Well, this is because if we're inserting an image into our layer, it's going to use the color information of the image, not what we had previously set. In fact, our color picker has completely gone. So fear not, our alpha setting node also has an RGB input. We can take a very simple basic color node and we can hook this in to the one which is setting the alpha. So we're using this graffiti for the alpha, and we can now use a simple color, which can be our nice bright hot pink. That can be setting the color in there. Okay, so that's working pretty nicely. We've got that layered on top. The final thing to do here would be to choose how shiny and glossy and reflective the paint would be. So the paint is going to be much, much shinier than the brickwork is. So let's go off and add one last BSDF layer. And by the way, it can be a good idea to name these things as you go along. So this is our brick. This is our reflection for the brick. This will be our graffiti color. And the last one we're going to add to our material, another BSDF. We'll name this one straight away, I guess. This one is going to be our graffiti reflection. Okay, so starting to get quite a few nodes here now. So we can select our final node again, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing we did before. When we added our reflection to the brick, we're also going to add a reflection to the graffiti. So let's tell this new node, you should also be a Beckman reflection. You should also have the dielectric Fresnel. So this is going to be a fairly common combo for you to add. and we perhaps just need to make it not quite so crisp. It's a very shiny reflection. Although just before we change that, let's also consider where this is going to go. This reflection is going to get added across the entire material. So we actually probably want the same alpha channel on this reflection as we have on our colour. So this is where we get to reuse all these nodes and layers and everything else. This is where the node system sort of really starts coming into its own. If we do more or less the exact same thing, then we could just insert this texture we have down here as the reflection color. Because keep in mind, a reflection is always sort of layered on top as just a generic extra anyway. So if we feed this nice contrasty image we have down here, and again, let me just slightly tweak our brightness a little bit more. We want to try and get rid of that black, the grayscale at the bottom. So if we feed this nice black and white image directly into our reflection, that will restrict where the reflection goes. So we now have our shiny glossy reflection popping on in the exact same place as the graffiti. So we don't specifically need to set a reflection just because a diffuse texture covers everything up, whereas a reflective texture tends to just get added on top of things. So for the same reason we have this general reflection down here, we didn't need to cut this into any sort of brickwork shape. You are safe just layering a reflection on top. We can do the same thing with our graffiti. But there we go then. Now, that's sort of the basic material done, so if you want to stop there, do feel free. But just as one final little thing, if this were a real-world texture, I might try and simplify this node system down, just by maybe grouping one or two things. So for example, down here, where we took our brick texture and we made it grayscale, we inverted the colors, and then we boosted the contrast and converted it into a bump, I would be quite tempted to grab all of these nodes, and then with the very first icon at the top here, we can group them up. So this, if we rename it, this is our color to normal converting. Again, remember, if you ever want to change these things or tweak them or just see what they're doing, click the little arrow. That will let you see inside to see what those nodes do. But you can always go back with this little trail of breadcrumbs at the top, back to the main nodes. So we can sort of squash this all down. And in fact, if you quite like this, if you think, hey, I'm probably going to do this process a lot with a lot of textures, do feel free to convert this into an asset. If you hit the Convert Create Asset button, this will give you the opportunity to name it, choose what category it goes in, and then this color to normal conversion will now appear in your list of assets as something you can recall again and again across different projects. But again, just in terms of tidying up, we'll pop these over there, and we can do the same thing with these. So this is my converting an image into an alpha channel collection. I'll probably leave this external just because we might want to change the color separately. But these ones over here, we could group these up. Let's not group up everything, because the idea with this is we might want to use a different image to drive things. So let's just press undo. Let's go back a step. Oops, come back. Where have you gone, material? When you group things up, probably leave the thing which is driving it external. So I'd actually just group up these three over here. So let's go for adding a group. And this is our image to alpha conversion. And again, so this will just simplify your node system. It'll make it a lot tidier, so you don't have to deal with quite so much mess. But there we go then. Here is our brickwork with our graffiti on top. And the graffiti itself has a nice shiny gloss to it. But again, do feel free to choose how shiny and glossy it is by changing that last reflection layer. Okay, I think that will do us for our brick wall.